The bidding started at $4. Elias Croft stood at the back of the livery yard with his hat in both hands and his jaw set, and he did not look at the men calling numbers from the rail. Beside him, pressed against his leg with both arms wrapped around his thigh, stood his boy Amos, who was 8 years old and had not spoken since the morning when someone had explained to him what a labor auction was and why his father was in one. The town of Harlan, Kansas had debts to settle, and Elias Croft had a back and 2 strong arms but no coin to offer. The county commissioner had a ledger that needed balancing before the month was out. Addie Prentice had died in February without a living soul to pay for the pine box, the grave, or the minister, and the town had covered it on credit. Now, it was April, and the credit was due. Elias had not known Addie Prentice well. She had run the post house on the far edge of town for 12 years, and he had collected mail there twice a month. She had been the kind of woman who handed you your letters without comment and never charged for the string she used to tie them. He had thought her a decent woman. He had not thought much more than that. Now he was standing in the livery yard with his hat in his hands and his boy pressed against his leg, and the commissioner was reading off his qualifications like items at a market. Carpenter, fence builder, strong, reliable, no debts of his own except what the land carried. $4, someone called. $4.50. 5. The men at the rail were ranchers. Mostly they needed spring work done and were not above getting it at a discount. Elias had known most of them for 15 years. He did not look at them. Then a voice he did not know said, $12. The yard went quiet. He looked up. She was standing at the far side of the rail, to the left of the gate, wearing a dark traveling coat that was dusty at the hem and a hat pinned so straight it looked as though a carpenter had leveled it. She was not young, somewhere in her middle 40s, though she carried herself in the erect and particular way of a woman who had grown accustomed to being underestimated. She had a leather valise at her feet and a notebook open in one hand. $12. Not loudly, just clearly. The commissioner looked at his ledger and looked at her and looked at his ledger again. Addie Prentice's funeral had cost $4.11. $12 was more than triple. I know what it is. She closed her notebook, picked up her valise, and waited. Nobody else called a number. Her name was Margaret Doyle, and she had come from St. Louis to take the post house that Addie Prentice had left behind. She was not running from anything. She was moving toward something, though she could not have said precisely what, except that a post house route on the Kansas plain was a thing that required managing, and she had spent 20 years managing things for other people, and it seemed to her that 20 years was long enough. She had corresponded with the county commissioner for 2 months about it, a letter in January and a letter in February, and an answer in March that said the building was available and the route was open and the county would be grateful for someone to fill it. She had sold her position at a dry goods import house, packed 2 trunks and a valise, and taken the train west. She had not corresponded with Elias Croft because she had not known Elias Croft existed. What she had known on the morning of the auction was that the town of Harlan had settled the funeral of the previous postmistress at community expense, and that the man standing in the livery yard with the pinched face and the boy attached to his leg had been designated the means of repaying that expense, and that this had seemed to her a peculiarly unjust arrangement, and that she had $12 in her traveling coat. She paid at the commissioner's table with no more ceremony than the paperwork required. She signed a document that said Elias Croft would perform 40 hours of labor at her property at such times as they mutually agreed, and she received a copy folded in thirds. Then she walked to where Elias stood with his hat still in his hands and held the paper out to him. He took it, read it, handed it back. I know what I signed. Then you know there is no deadline stated and no penalty for delay. She put the paper in her valise. You may do the work at your convenience. I will not be sending someone to your door to collect. Amos, pressed against his father's leg, had been watching her with the fixed attention of a child who had not yet learned to disguise his interest. She noticed. She did not smile at him in the bright, performative way that adults sometimes used on children they were trying to impress. She looked at him the way one person looks at another when they want to remember the face. How old are you? Amos looked at his father. His father gave a small nod. 8. He stood a little straighter. Can you carry a bucket? I can carry 2. Then perhaps you can help with the dairy when your father brings you. She turned back to Elias. I have 4 cows and no experience with them. The previous occupant managed, but she left no instructions. I would be grateful for any direction. Elias looked at the post house at the end of the road and thought about the 40 hours he owed and the fence that needed mending on his south pasture and the planting that was 3 weeks behind because the spring had been hard. I'll come Thursday. He put his hat back on, and that was the end of it. She picked up her valise and walked to the post house and went inside, and the door closed behind her, and Elias watched it, and Amos watched it too. Papa. Elias looked down at his boy. He did not have an answer, but Amos seemed to understand that and let it go. Thursday came. Elias brought Amos because there was no other arrangement and because the boy had asked 3 times and then stopped asking, which was always worse. The post house was a low building of 2 rooms at the front and a lean-to at the back, with a dairy shed built onto the east side that was newer than the rest and still smelled of fresh-cut pine. The cows were in the shed. Margaret Doyle was in the shed with them, standing with a bucket in one hand and a look on her face that was not panic but was adjacent to it. One of them bit me this morning. Cows don't bite. Elias stepped around her into the stall. She used her gums. Extensively, he looked at the cow in question, a roan dairy animal of roughly 8 years, thick across the barrel and supremely untroubled by the presence of humans. He had worked cattle his whole life. He set his hand along the cow's back and she turned her head and regarded him with the calm, bovine patience of an animal that knows it is needed. He showed Margaret how to position herself. He showed her the rhythm of it, the grip, the angle, the patience required. He did not make her feel ignorant for not knowing. He demonstrated, and when she took over, he watched without comment until she had found the rhythm herself, and then he moved to the next stall. Amos had settled on a hay bale near the door and was watching everything with great seriousness. She's got it now. He said this as a person renders a fair judgment. She does. Elias kept his eyes on the second cow. By the end of the first hour, Margaret had milked 2 of the 4 without incident, and the other 2 waited with the patience of animals that understood their turn would come. She had filled 1 bucket and started a second. Her hands were tired and her back was stiff, and she was not complaining about either of these things. She was paying attention to what she was doing. When the milking was finished, she strained the full buckets through the cloth she had rigged over the cooling pan, the way he had shown her, pressing out the foam carefully and not rushing it. The separator was an old one with a cracked wooden handle, but she had wrapped it in strips of boot leather, and it held. She poured off the cream into the brown crock on the shelf and covered it with a board to keep the flies out. She noted the yield in a small book she kept hooked on the shed wall in her own shorthand that he could not read and did not try to. That was when he understood she would not be leaving. A woman who wrote things down was a woman who expected to read them back. He spent the rest of the morning on the fence along the east property line, which had been built by someone optimistic about the posts and careless about the wire. He found 3 gaps and repaired 2 of them before the light changed, driving new staples into the posts with measured blows and pulling the wire taut with a come-along he had brought in the wagon bed. Margaret brought him water at mid-morning, cold from the well, in a tin cup, and left it on the post without interrupting him, and went back inside. Amos had followed her. Elias noticed this and said nothing about it. When he came in at noon, Amos was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him and a pencil in his hand. Margaret was at the stove. The table had 3 places set, not 2. 3, he stood in the doorway long enough to be certain he had counted right. He had. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down. Nobody commented on the 3rd place. It had simply been set. Amos put his paper away. Margaret brought the pot from the stove. Empty buildings in Kansas accumulate problems the way a pond accumulates ice, slowly and then all at once. The roof above the lean-to had a seam that had separated over winter. The door on the dairy shed hung wrong on its hinges, admitting a draft that made the interior unreliable. The provisions Margaret had brought from St. Louis were organized with the precision of a woman accustomed to careful accounts, but she had not yet found the rhythm of what the house would consume in a week, and she was uncertain what she could source locally and what would need to come from Abilene. Elias came on Thursday mornings, then on Saturdays as well, because the fence work was more than he had estimated, then on Tuesdays for reasons neither of them stated aloud. Each time, Amos came. Each time, the table had 3 places when they came in at noon. On the 3rd Tuesday, Elias arrived to find Amos already there. The boy had walked the half-mile from their place on his own and arrived 40 minutes before his father, which he learned from Margaret, who told him while standing at the ledger table with a pen in her hand. He can't just, Elias stopped. He carried 2 buckets. Margaret returned her attention to the column she was working through. Both full, without spilling. Elias looked toward the dairy shed, where Amos could be heard talking to the roan cow in a low and serious voice. He is 8. He is capable. She turned the ledger page. There is a difference. He went to the shed. Amos looked up without guilt. I came to help. You walked half a mile without telling me. You were mending the harness. Amos considered the fence post in front of him. You had the look. Apparently, he had a look that meant do not interrupt me. He had not known about this look. He filed it away. Ask next time. Can I come? He looked at his son and at the dairy shed and through the open door at the post house where the lamp was lit on the table and a woman was moving a careful pen down a column of numbers. Ask. The answer will be yes. But ask. The trouble arrived in the form of a letter, as trouble in Kansas generally did. By that point, the post house had taken on the particular character of a place that is being minded. The window above the table had new caulking where the cold had come through. The dairy shed had a latch that closed properly. The route ledger was current to the day, every delivery logged in Margaret's careful columns, and the 4 cows had names now, because Amos had named them and the names had stuck. The roan he called Pearl. The brown jersey in the far stall he called Corn. He had named the other 2 Needle and Thread for reasons he explained to Margaret at length and to his father not at all. A man named Coburn held paper on 3 of the 4 sections adjacent to the post house route. He had held it for 11 years and had been patient about it in the way that men with money are patient, because patience costs them nothing. When Addie Prentice was alive, he had left the post house alone, because Addie Prentice had an arrangement with the county that was older than his paper and harder to displace. When Addie Prentice died, he had waited through the winter, and now it was spring, and he had written to the county commissioner suggesting that the post house route fell on land he controlled and that the new arrangement would require his approval. The commissioner brought the letter to Margaret on a Wednesday morning. He was apologetic. He had not known about Coburn's paper. The arrangement that had stood for 12 years had stood on Addie Prentice's particular relationship with the land office in Topeka, and that relationship had died with her. Margaret read the letter twice. She thanked the commissioner for bringing it. She said nothing about what she intended to do. She spent the afternoon at the table with Addie Prentice's records, 12 years of route logs and delivery receipts and land use agreements in a hand so small it required good light to read. She went through them in order. It took 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours she had found what she was looking for. A survey note from 14 years back, pre-dating Coburn's paper by 3 years. That established the route corridor as a public use easement under county authority. The note was written in the hand of a surveyor whose name she did not recognize and signed by a commissioner who had been dead for 5 years, but it was witnessed and dated and had not been rescinded. She did not know enough about Kansas land law to be certain this was sufficient. She knew it was significant. She needed someone who could tell her how significant. Elias came on Thursday. She had the document on the table. She did not lead with the problem. She waited until noon, until Amos had started on his soup and the bread was out and the lamp was giving its steady light, and then she told him what Coburn's letter said. She watched his face move through several things in quick succession. He held out his hand. She gave him the document. He read it slowly, with the full attention of a man for whom reading does not come so easily that he can afford to be careless with it, and she looked at the window while he worked through it. When he set it down, he was quiet for a moment. "This holds." "You're certain?" "Coburn's lawyer will tell him it holds before the end of the week." He smoothed the edge of the paper with one thumb. "He'll try something else. What else is there? Make it uncomfortable. Drive the mail contract to a man he controls. Find cause to contest the dairy permit. Make people in town think twice about doing business here." He's patient and not in a hurry. He looked up from the paper. "He'll expect you to run." She looked at the lamp on the table, at the ledger open beside it, 3 weeks of careful entries in her own hand, at the dairy shed visible through the window, where 2 of the cows were standing at the fence with the mild, territorial interest of animals that have decided a place belongs to them. "I did not come from St. Louis to be patient." Amos, who had been quietly working on his bread, set it down on the plate. He looked at Margaret. He looked at his father. He picked up the bread again. 3 weeks passed before Coburn moved, and when he moved it was not through the land office. He made an offer. He sent a man named Graves, polite and soft-spoken, who had the careful manners of someone accustomed to carrying unpleasant messages without becoming the target of them. The letter offered to purchase the post house and its attached dairy operation at a price that was genuinely fair. That was the uncomfortable part. It was not an insult. It was what the property was worth, perhaps a little more. And it came with an introduction to a position in Abilene that Coburn apparently knew was open. Graves left the letter and departed without pressing for an answer. Margaret set it on the table and left it there for 2 days. She did not tell Elias when he came on Thursday. She was not yet certain what she was going to do, and she had not formed the habit of showing people her uncertainty. Amos found the letter. He was not snooping. He had come in from the dairy shed to wash his hands, and the letter was there on the table, open, and he could read well enough to understand that it was an offer to buy the post house and that a position in Abilene was mentioned. He read it twice, the way his father read things, carefully and without hurrying. Then he folded it back along its creases and put it where he had found it. He went back to the shed. He stayed there a long time, in the particular stillness of a child working something through. On Friday morning, Elias came without Amos. He had fence work to finish and meant to bring the boy in the afternoon. He arrived to find Margaret in the dairy shed at the morning milking, which she now managed without any assistance from him, and which she performed with the efficient. unshowy competence of a woman who had learned a thing and saw no reason to be modest about it. He told her he had received a letter from Coburn's man offering to contract his spring fence work at a rate better than he was getting independently. She looked up from the bucket. He made me an offer as well. She turned back to the roan cow. I haven't answered it. What will you say? She looked at the dairy shed, the pines still pale, the stanchions solid, the feed measured out in portions she had calculated herself through 3 weeks of trial and error. She looked at the note she had written and pinned to the post above the second stall, listing each cow's character and each cow's preference, in the small precise hand she used for things she meant to keep. No, she lifted the bucket clear. But I am not certain that is enough. Coburn has more patience than I have resources, and he knows it. Elias was quiet. Then boots on the packed dirt outside, and Amos came through the doorway with his jacket buttoned crooked and his hair uncombed, and he had something in his hands. A biscuit tin, the kind sold sealed at general stores, pried open and repacked, rattling as he walked. He came to where Margaret stood and held it out to her. She took it. She looked inside. Coins, pennies, mostly, and a scattering of nickels, arranged in no particular order. She counted once and counted again because the number surprised her. $1.37. She looked at Amos. He stood very straight. He was watching her with the earnest, complete seriousness that children bring to things they have decided matter. That is mine. He held himself very straight. I have been saving it since I was 6. Papa told me I could save it for whatever I wanted. He looked at the tin in her hands. I want you to have it for staying. She could not speak for a moment. Amos, he was not finished. It is not enough to pay back what the town is owed. He meant Coburn and the commissioner and the whole invisible arrangement that had put his father in the livery yard with his hat pressed flat in both hands. But it is what I have. And you set a place for me. Every time. Even when you did not know if we were coming. You set a place for me. He said this with the plain certainty of a child, stating a rule he has understood from the beginning. That means I am one of yours, and if you leave, you will not have enough places. He closed his mouth. He had said the thing he meant to say. Elias had not moved. Margaret looked at the tin in her hands and at the boy in front of her, and for a moment her face simply showed what was in it, the way a lamp shows through thin curtain cloth. Will you help me with the roan if I stay? He considered this seriously. She does not bite anyone now. She does, but she minds you, which is near enough. He stepped forward and, without any further hesitation, put both arms around her waist and pressed his face against her shoulder. She put her hand on the back of his head. She looked up and found Elias watching, and he did not look away, and neither did she. He was gone for most of Saturday. He left word with Amos to go to the post house for the morning. Amos went without questions, because he had an instinct for which moments required quiet. Elias drove to town. He went first to the stable, where he kept the gray gelding he had ridden for 11 years, the one he had bought as a 3-year-old with money saved the first year he had his own land. It was not the most valuable thing he owned. It was the thing he would have held on to if everything else had to go. He sold it to the livery at the fair price, which was not the highest price and not the lowest, and which was enough for what he needed. He went from the stable to the land office. He asked for the clerk named Holt, a steady man who had been behind that counter for 30 years and did not see any use in obscuring things. He told Holt what he needed. Holt listened without interrupting. He pulled the relevant documents from the files and laid them flat on the counter and explained what was possible, in plain language, without ornamentation. It took the rest of the morning. When he was done, Elias had a document. Witnessed, notarized, entered in the county record book on page 212. A copy folded in his coat pocket. He drove back to the post house. Margaret was at the table with the ledger. Amos was in the shed. The lamp was lit. 3 cups were on the shelf. Elias sat down across from her and put the document on the table. She opened it. Read it. Read it again. It transferred his right to the south quarter of his own land, the section abutting the post house route, into a permanent public use corridor co. registered with the post house operation under her name. This nullified Coburn's capacity to contest the route from that direction. It also listed her name beside his on the deed to the post house dairy, on the grounds that 40 hours of labor had been more than adequately rendered and that the repair work to the shed constituted a legitimate investment. Her name. In the county record. She looked up at him. He was watching the lamp. The 40 hours are paid. His voice was even and plain. This is the rest. She looked at the document again, at her name beside his, at the surveyor's corridor running through his own land in both their names, permanent and recorded and not subject to Coburn's patience or anyone else's. He stood. He went to the door of the dairy shed and told Amos to come and wash up. Then he came back and took his place at the table. Amos came in from the shed and went straight to the shelf. He took down the 3rd cup, brought it to the table, and set it at his place, the one that had always been set for him, the one that would go on being set. He poured from the pot. He poured 3 cups without asking whether it was wanted, because that was how it was done here, and because he had been setting the terms of this family for longer than either adult had been willing to admit. Outside, the wind came off the flat land and moved through the spring grass along the route. The evening light lay long across the dairy shed and the fence line and the south quarter where the corridor now ran in 2 names. Inside, Amos set the pot back on its ring. The 3 cups steamed in the lamplight. On the wall of the dairy shed, the small notebook hung on its hook with that morning's yield recorded in neat columns. And pearl and corn and needle and thread stood in their stalls with their full udders and their settled patience, and the lamp on the table burned steady against the coming dark. It would burn again tomorrow morning, and the morning after, and Amos would set 3 places, because that was what was done here, and that was how things stood.